Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this evening. We're so glad that you were able to join us. We know that September is a super busy month for educators, and just really looking forward to being with you all in this space and appreciate you taking the time to be here. This is our second of a two-part webinar series around social, emotional, and academic development in the math classrooms. And part two tonight is going to focus on planning to incorporate SEAD into math lessons. So let's go ahead and get started. First off, we wanted to let you know that we hope that if you enjoy the webinar tonight and learn a lot from it, that you might be interested in joining our network of educators from around the country. We are committed to solving the real problems that real educators face, and we know the best way to do that is by engaging with all of you, learning as much as we can about you and what you need to be able to do your jobs better. And so if you take this survey at achievethecore.org/CA-sign-up, there will be a short survey that you can fill out, tell us a little bit about yourselves, and then you will be a member of our network and hopefully you will get information about upcoming professional learning opportunities, new tools and resources, and all the things that we provide to educators. So if you want to also, like I said, keep up to date on free resources, upcoming webinars, other learning opportunities, and just be a part of our network by joining. And also, if you want to learn more, my email address, I'm Jenny Beltramini. You can feel free to email me anytime, or my colleague, Joy DeLizo Osborne. And the link, again, is there for you to join the network, and you can learn a lot more about Student Achievement Partners and our Core Advocate Network on achievethecore.org. Also, another great way to stay in touch with us and be up to date on the things we're doing and the offerings that we have is to follow us on one of our many social media platforms. So Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest, or Instagram are also really great ways to stay in touch with what we're doing and things that we offer. So tonight, who is with you on this webinar? Like I said, I'm Jenny Beltramini. I'm a designer at Student Achievement Partners. I'm located in the far northwest corner of Washington State. And I'm joined by Nathan Johnson, who's an instructional coach in Wyoming Public Schools near Grand Rapids, Michigan, and then also Karina, who is at Saddleback Valley Unified School District in California. It's near Orange County, California. So you'll be hearing mostly from them tonight. We'd love for you to engage with us during the webinar. I know sometimes webinars are one-way interaction where we're giving you a lot of information, but we also value your voice and want to be in conversation with you. So you can tweet during or after the webinar with us. So we tweet at Achieve the Core, and we use the hashtag Core Advocates. And also my Twitter at Jenny Beltro, and Karina's Twitter is also there. So feel free to tweet with us. And we can use the chat. So feel free to ask questions, talk with other participants, share resources throughout the webinar tonight. We know that that's a great way for you all to have conversation and be engaging with one another during the webinar. If you need help with something technical or just anything, finding the links to things, feel free to private chat my colleague, Jasmine Costello. And then also after the webinar, you will have access to this recording and all of the resources, including the handouts and the slide deck itself as well. So those will be emailed to you after the webinar. We just wanted to give you a heads up that we value your input, and we want to make sure that we're meeting your needs and that this is a valuable learning experience for you all. So we'd love for you to take a few minutes at the end of the webinar tonight to complete a short feedback form and let us know your feedback from tonight. And also, if you need 1 hour, if you need professional learning time, if you do that survey at the end of the webinar, you will also be given an hour of professional learning. A certificate will come in your email. And even if you don't need that, we'd appreciate you taking time to share your feedback. So a link for that will be at the end of the webinar this evening. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the second webinar in a learning series. And so you are here Our webinar 1 was introducing SEAD themes and connections for equitable math instruction. That took place a couple of weeks ago. But don't worry if you didn't attend that or weren't able to watch it yet. You'll be able to jump right into webinar 2 tonight, which is around planning to incorporate social and emotional learning into math lessons. And we wanted to also say that if you are able to, before September 24th, watch either live or asynchronously both webinars 1 and 2, you will be invited to join a community of practice where we'll have an opportunity to continue engaging with one another around implementing SEAD in math classrooms. So we'll give you more information about that at the end of the webinar tonight. But if that's something that you're interested in, be sure to stay with us until the end of the webinar. And we'll let you know about that. So I mentioned that part 1 already happened. However, you can still watch it and even get professional learning credit for it if you need that. So it's available using this bit.ly link or just going to achievethecore.org and going into professional learning, and it's one of our past webinars that's listed there. So you can watch it on demand, no certificate available, just not without the professional learning certificate on our website. And you will have the link to fill out so that you can get credit for being there and join our community of practice, or you can watch it on demand through our Teachable platform and be able to get a certificate for professional learning. So hopefully if you didn't see that one after tonight, you'll be interested in going back and watching webinar 1 as well. All right, so we're going to just jump in and get started with the content of our webinar for this evening. So some of the goals, some of the things we'll be talking about is thinking about how the standards for mathematical practice, which are part of Common Core or College and Career Ready standards, how do they intersect with the 4 SEL themes that are in Stride 3? And I have a picture of Stride 3. It's the blue booklet that's down in the bottom of the screen. That's going to be our primary resource that we're going to be talking about this evening. So there's a bit.ly link there for you to have that open. You'll probably want to be able to reference it throughout our evening tonight. And those 4 SEL themes, we're going to touch on them tonight, but they were talked about a lot more in depth in webinar 1 as well. So you can watch that if you didn't before to learn more about them as well. Learn about a planning process for math lessons that incorporate those SEL themes. And that planning process is also in Stride 3, the blue booklet. And then you'll be able to hear from educators from both Nathan and Karina talk about the lesson planning process and how they used it in their classrooms. So there's also a resource sheet of all the resources from both webinars 1 and 2. So you have to scroll down to page 2 to find the resources for tonight's webinar. But throughout the webinar tonight, Nathan and Karina will be talking about a variety of resources, and those are all linked in that resource document. And so you might want to have that open as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Nathan Johnson. Like I said, he's an instructional coach at Wyoming Public Schools. Nathan is works in a K-4 school. So he works primarily with K-4 teachers, but he has experience himself teaching and working with grades 8 K all the way up through 8th grade. So he's going to kick us off tonight talking about how do the standards for mathematical practice intersect with the 4 SEL themes in Stride 3.
So the content standards that we're all familiar with, I always think of as the what. That's what we need our students to do. That's what we need to teach them, right? That's like the math that they have to show that they've mastered. I consider the practice, the math practices or the practice standards, the how, right? That's the how they're showing that they're learning it. That's the how they're doing it. Math practices describe what students should be doing while they are engaging in those rich math tasks. That's the name of the game with the math practices. So here are the math practices. Again, you probably have seen this before. This is an interesting diagram because it sort of structures them a little differently than maybe you've seen them before. If you look to the left and if you tilt your head sideways, you see math practice 1 and 6. I think they have that written that way because really those math practices encompass all the other math practices. You're going to make sense of problems and persevere in solving them, attending to precision, no matter what. Sorry about that. So there's a link right at the top, and I think that will be chatted out. We're not here to spend too much time going in depth with the standards for math practices. That would be outside of the scope of what we're doing. But if you are interested in wanting to hear more, or wanting to learn more, I should say, about them, there's a fantastic resource that can be linked that you can check out and dig a little deeper and see a little bit more. And we'll talk more about them as we continue on with our session here today. So remember, this was sort of a two-part, or not two-part, I should say, but there was two prongs to what we're looking at: standards for math practices and how they interact with the SEAD themes. If you were part of the first, or it's not part of, if you were able to see the first webinar, they talked a lot more about these four themes. But if you weren't there for that, that's okay too. We'll just do a quick overview of these themes right here. And as Jenny mentioned, our resource, we see that lovely little picture in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Page 6, if you've got that printed up, or if you've got it saved on your computer and you want to take a look, that's where you could learn a little bit more about them. So just going around, starting with identity, those are the deeply held beliefs that one has about their ability to be a mathematician. Now, obviously, their identity extends far past just mathematics, but in the scope of what we're doing today, we're keeping it in that realm. So I associate a student's identity with what it means to be a mathematician, and what is that? And, can I be a mathematician? What does my identity say about my ability to do that? Discourse is the free exchange of ideas with one another. It's that increase in student talk time in class. It's that academic language. It's those students having a back and forth around the content, around the concept or skill that you're working on. Agency is self-awareness, self-management, self-confidence, and it's knowing that you can do it, that you are in control of your own destiny as a mathematician. Mathematics is so beautiful because although there may be one right answer, there are limitless ways to get there. And so a student with a strong sense of agency realizes that and has flexibility in thinking that they can get from point A to point B, maybe multiple different ways, or a way that other students in the class can. So having that agency is having the confidence to know that you can do it. Belonging is feeling like you are an important member of the class, of the mathematics class. I think a strong sense of belonging can help to further an environment that's inclusive and equitable for others. And we know that that's something we need in our schools. I think as we look at these four themes, we see that they relate to one another and there is some overlap between them. And I think that's a theme that I continued to think about as I went through the planning process and implementing the lesson and then reflecting on the lesson. It became apparent to me how connected they all are. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later. All right, so now when we're talking about the standards for math practices and the SEAD themes, because that's why we're here. We're trying to see how they interconnect. In the resource, a pathway to equitable math instruction, the next couple slides, we're going to just be pulling some screenshots directly from that source. As we can see, this one right here is on page 9. If you take a look, the resource has already done some of this work for us and told us how they see these SEAD themes interacting with the standards for math practices. And if you take a look at the chart here, the first thing that probably jumps out to you is identity is present in all of them, or can be present in all of them. To me, of the four themes, identity is probably the one that you can see a little more clearly in all of the SMPs. Not to say that it's the easiest to develop in students, but I think the capacity is there to do it a lot of different ways. So we see that that's a very strong connection between an SEAD theme and a standard for math practice. On the other end of the spectrum, you might look at belonging all the way on the right and see that it is not as represented. I think some of these SEAD themes are quite challenging to address in the standards for math practices. Excuse me, and I think belonging might be one of the most challenging. I think the not filled in circles denotes that there may be a slight connection between that standard for math practice and that SEAD theme, whereas the full shaded in bullet means it's a strong connection. You know, I think some of these are very strong connections. I think of SMP1, make sense of problems and persevere in solving them. And to me, that just screams out agency, right? Like if someone has that strong sense of agency that they know they can get to their solution, you know, and it doesn't have to be prescribed to them. They don't have to follow a blueprint. They can problem solve to get there. To me, that aligns really well with SMP1. Discourse, the SEAD theme, I mean, it can't align any better than SMP3, constructing viable arguments and critiquing the reasoning of others. So some of these I feel are a little easy to connect to than others. And I think that's a challenge that teachers are going to have as they explore the idea of really integrating these SE themes in their math curriculum. So just kind of moving along here, when we look at page 16 in the Pathways to Equitable Math Instruction, they've given some suggested activities, and I know that it's way too small for you to read, but you'll be able to take a look at your own leisure. Just to sort of give some of the bullet points, they actually go as far as to say, here is an activity that you could do for a very specific math concept. And unless you teach that grade in that math concept, you probably aren't too interested in it necessarily, but it can be adapted for any grade and any concept. A lot of what they talk about are, I would consider like math routines. For instance, they note identity and belonging. One strategy to use is an activity called Which One Doesn't Belong, which I'm familiar with and I've done with students. Another thing that jumps out to me, like for discourse, would be number talks as well as agency, you know, where students are interacting with one another and they're creating solutions on their own and they're explaining their way of thinking. So a lot of these routines that, you know, a lot of times teachers say, I would love to do number talks. I just don't have time. I have so much content. I have so many standards to teach. But when we're teaching number talks, we're focusing on standards for math practices. So we still are teaching the standards, right? It just seems a lot of times we prioritize those content standards over the standards for math practices. And really the math practices is where our students are really growing as mathematicians. It's where they're strengthening their identity. So I think if we kind of think outside the box and think about where can we start to include more of these routines, where we can start to grow our students in those aspects, I think that's going to allow us to deliver that content or allow our students to explore that content at a little bit higher level down the road. So as you have an opportunity, take a look through some of those. You might already be familiar with some of the routines they mentioned. Some of them might be new to you. So the next one, again, this is a couple pages down the road, same idea. They're still giving you some ideas of routines and strategies that you can try. However, the cool thing about this is they've got actual videos linked. So when you go into the document, you can click on, for instance, contemplate then calculate, and it will take you to a website where they will show you a couple different examples of this particular skill. Most of the videos that I watched or saw were junior high, middle school, high school. Not to say that you can't do this with elementary. I'm an instructional coach in elementary school, and I am trying to do as much of this as I can with elementary. Sometimes it's a little trickier to adapt it. But if you really think about what is the purpose of this routine, what are we trying to get students to do, I think you can adapt it for any grade level, K all the way up through high school. So again, as you have an opportunity, I would encourage you to take a look at this resource as you're thinking about, you know, what are some of these strategies that I might be able to try? What are some of these routines that I might be able to try? This is a fantastic resource to sort of, you know, dip your toe in.
Thank you, Nathan. My section will talk a little bit more about using the lesson planning template. My name is Karina Calderon. I'm a teacher, fifth grade teacher here in Saddleback Valley, California. My section specifically will be discussing what is the planning process for math lessons that incorporate the SEL themes, and we'll take a look at the planning template step by step so that you can implement it into your own classroom. This first section comes from pages 13 and 14 of the Stride 3 pathway for instruction. And at here in the beginning, you can see the SEAD planning template tool. The SEAD planning template integrates the social emotional themes that Nathan mentioned before. So the 4 SEL themes of identity, belonging, agency, and discourse. And these SEAD themes are interconnected with the standards for math practice. The planning process includes 3 crucial steps that you would complete prior to the lesson. And these steps are laid out here. So the first step is to identify the priority math standard, your content standard. Secondly, you would identify 1 or more of those SEAD themes that you would like to focus on in that lesson. And the last section, you would be connecting the standards for math practice to those SEAD themes that you identified that you would like to focus on your lesson. And again, in this slide, there is that that intersection of the SEL themes in accordance to the standard for math practice that's laid out in the table in the Stride 3 document. However, you can decide at your own if you feel like your lesson would work well with a specific standard for math practice as well as a SEAD theme. After identifying the first steps of your lesson plan, you would then create and implement on your SEAD strategy. So there are 2 ways specifically that you could use the lesson planning template. The first way is for a planning process, and you would complete all steps prior to your lesson, thinking about how you would embed the SEAD strategy into an existing lesson plan, perhaps review the sample lessons that Nathan had mentioned earlier, consider the teacher and student actions that would happen during the lesson prior to you actually teaching the lesson. You could also choose the route of using the template as a reflection process. This might mean that step 4 of the lesson plan and on, you would complete at the end of completing your lesson. If you choose to do it on a reflection basis, you're reflecting on how the SEAD strategy was implemented into your classroom, how well it worked, maybe how prominent it was to see that SEL theme within your lesson, maybe your future steps that you would like to do following up to promote more of that SEL theme in your classroom. And it would be more of a reflection as opposed to a planning process. So there are 2 ways to use that lesson planning tool. There's a section within the planning template that has you identify the student and teacher actions. And again, this depends on whether you decide to do this template prior to your lesson or as a reflection process. If you are doing it as a lesson planning process, you would write out the desired teacher and student actions that you would want to incorporate into your lesson so that you can highlight identity, you can highlight belonging, or you can highlight discourse or one of the SEL themes. If you're working on it as a reflection process, then you would reflect on those teacher and student actions that were occurred during the lesson and think about how you would adjust any parts of the lesson to increase access to perhaps that SEL theme or increase access to the content. This last section is the summary of practices and the best practices reflection. So here you would write out your reflection after completing the lesson plan in your classroom. And some of the things that you can think about is how did the SEAD theme and the standards for math practice provide students access to the math content? You can reflect on the strategies that you use within your classroom to maybe elicit students' thinking, to allow students to communicate with each other, perhaps your teacher actions that you did to make sure that your students' thinking is valued within your classroom. And you can think about also how you would continue to integrate the SEAD themes within your math classrooms. Because as we all know, one lesson isn't going to change your math instruction. And so you would want to continue to incorporate these SEAD themes so that it is more evident inside your classroom. And so this summary of practices is that time where you can take the time to reflect on how the lesson went, with just thinking about how you can incorporate those SEAD themes into your classroom, and then thinking about your future actions for the rest of the year so that you can continue to incorporate more of that social emotional learning into your math lessons. So I want to invite you to write your response in the chat to which part of the lesson planning template do you find most helpful. Again, there are two parts to the lesson planning template. You can do all steps prior to the lesson, or you can choose to do just the first 3 steps of identifying the SEAD theme, the standards for math practice, and your content standard prior to the lesson, and then reflecting on your strategies for delivery as well as the student actions.
Thanks, Karina. I'm gonna, maybe while folks are looking, I'll just remind everybody that the lesson planning template itself is on pages 13 and 14. So you might wanna take a look at that while you're thinking about your answer in the chat. And then I'm just gonna, I know we have a part later on for questions, but there was some chatting in the chat about the resource itself. So I wanted to just try to clarify for a second while folks are answering the question that this resource is, it's considered stride 3 of the equitable math instruction, or the Pathways to Equitable Math Instruction Toolkit. So it's an online toolkit that's free and available for anybody to use. And there's 5 strides is what they're called, but there's sort of 5 workbooks that each have a different topic. And so stride 3 is around integrating social, emotional, and academic development in the math classroom. And so that's the resource that we're focused on for this learning series, which is the one that we gave a link to, and the one that hopefully you're looking at right now, and looking at the lesson planning template on those 2 pages. And I see some folks are answering, so I'll be quiet so you can finish looking and answering the question in the chat.
We'll have a little bit more time for others to add their thoughts to the chat, but I do like already a couple thoughts about how the reflection process could be a helpful activity to accomplish during, like, as a PLC activity with other colleagues perhaps at your school site. And we do invite you to join our community of practice so that you have that opportunity to reflect with us as well after using the lesson planning template within your classroom. I also see some responses about identifying the standard for math practice as well as its alignment to a SEAD theme. We know that that's the purpose of the lesson planning tool, is to make sure that we are aligning those 2 together. And so just taking that moment to think about prior to your lesson, how can you amplify that SEAD theme within your classroom is really important. And I think for me, that's one of the most helpful things that I found with the lesson planning template, is just prior to my lesson, thinking about that SEAD theme and thinking about how I wanted to amplify it with my teacher and student actions. Section 3 will discuss how did the lesson planning process go for myself and Nathan. And so we'll both share our experience using this lesson planning tool within our classroom, and just our reflections about how we personally felt with using this tool.
All right, thank you, Karina. So I taught a lesson in a 4th grade classroom. I attempted to use 2 SEAD themes, agency and discourse. And the 2 standards for math practices I picked were Math Practice 1 and Math Practice 3. Make sense of problems, persevere in solving them, and construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. So what I did was, right off the bat, I listed, or I put up here my learning target and success criteria from the lesson. And noticed that my learning target and success criteria were focused on a math practice and not on a content standard. And it was very difficult for me to do that. Now, having said that, there is a content standard and it's very much involved in the lesson. But from a planning perspective, I wanted to start with the math practice and start with the how they're going to be learning. It was something I kind of experimented with, and I thought, you know what, I'm doing this SEAD lesson, so let's just try some stuff. I think it had great results. There was some fantastic conversations. There was some working together. There were some interesting ways to get to a solution pathway. But that was one of the biggest differences for me using this template as opposed to just lesson planning, was that I was starting with the math practice and the SEAD themes in mind first. I mean, in the back of my mind, I knew what the content was, but I was spending a lot more focus on that planning initially. The lesson itself was adapted from a 3-act math task I got from Graham Fletcher. And essentially, you can see the little picture. There's a fidget spinner that he starts, and then he starts the little timer, and then the video stops. If you're familiar with 3-act math tasks, they are fantastic for agency because they do not really tell the kids what to do. They pose a question and make a wondering, and then students need to ask the right questions to get the information to solve the problem. So when I was thinking about agency, I thought this would be a great type of lesson. The actual content standard was for NBT B6 around division. So eventually they realized they got to the point where they had to do division to figure out exactly how long it spun. I think it ended up being like 3.5 minutes, and they were all shocked because that was not even close to what their guesses are. Go to the next slide. So just some of the things I thought about in the reflection phase. I should also mention that I did use the entire template beforehand. I still reflected at the end, but I went through each of the components first because it was my first time using the template and I wanted to do that for the first time. I could see using it more as a reflection tool as I'm more familiar with it, but right out of the bat, I wanted to make sure I was hitting each of those points. So some of the things upon my reflection afterwards: plan opportunities for students to interact with one another. Sometimes it happens naturally, rarely it seems, but it's much easier to plan that. It might happen naturally, but I think as a teacher, we need to embed that and build that in. So there are opportunities for students to interact with one another. Another thing, routines and practice for dialogue and discourse will help. I'm an instructional coach, so I do not have my own classroom anymore. I have to borrow my teachers' classrooms when I want to do something like this. Last year, of course, was a very interesting year in education. I know everyone in this Zoom room knows that. So as a result, there was not as much small group work because of COVID protocols. There was not as much discourse as there might have been in a normal year. So that was a little bit more challenging as I think back on this specific lesson. Something I would have done differently, or I would make sure I would do in the future, is spend more time practicing around that dialogue and discourse, having things like sentence stems if they get stuck on what to say, stuff like that, to just help push that conversation along. Another thing I realized is I needed something to hook students and pique their interest. The 3-act math task was a great thing for that because they generally are very curious. But if we're trying to think about those SEAD themes, we want our students to have agency. It cannot be, hey guys, we're going to do 20 problems out of our book and we're going to see how many we get right. Nobody's getting excited about that. There's no genuine curiosity about that. So I think if I'm going to try to build my students' agency, I want them to be excited about what they're doing so that they're actually going to try to persevere and problem solve. As I mentioned earlier, I planned focusing on the how of the lesson before the what. I knew in my mind what the content was going to be, but I really wanted to think, how are they going to get there? How are they going to be interacting? And then I can build the lesson around that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that's a departure from what I traditionally do. And then finally, have some guided questions prepared beforehand. It really helped with when the conversation stalled. This was something I had thought about in the planning phase, and I even wrote some questions on a little note card. And when they were doing their small group work and I was walking around and you could sort of hear a little bit of crickets, I had some questions that I could ask that would sort of pique up the conversation and get them talking again. And I was just walking around from group to group doing that, trying to, fan the flames, so to speak, of that conversation. So these are just some of the things I noticed after delivering the lesson in reflection, that if and when I'm going back to do another lesson where I'm trying to embed the social emotional learning, these are things I'll definitely keep in the forefront of my mind.
Similar to Nathan, I also used the lesson planning template prior to teaching my lesson. So I completed all steps except the reflection at the end prior to my lesson. Similar to Nathan's thought, I wanted to make sure that I use the template that first time around just to make sure that I'm thinking about all the specific strategies that I want to use within my classroom. I completed my SEAD lesson in a 5th grade dual immersion classroom. I focused my lesson on the SEAD theme discourse, and my standard for math practice was students being able to construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. Similar to Nathan, I presented it to students in student-friendly language, and I talked to them how we were each going to work on showing our own thinking, talking about each other's thinking, and building on our own each other's thinking. I wanted to make sure that they were comparing and connecting on each other's strategies, and through that their discourse would be amplified in the classroom. My task was specifically adopted from illustrative math. Illustrative math had the task all together. I decided to decompose the task and adapt it just a little bit to fit my students' needs. So I deconstructed the problem and we went through the information together so that they are accessing the situation that's happening in the problem. And the original task from illustrative math asked them to write their answer in several ways. It asked them to write their answer using only hours, using a whole number of hours and a whole number of minutes, and lastly, to use only minutes. I decided to take that section out of my problem and make it more open-ended so that naturally students were writing their responses in different ways. And so that after our lesson, we can talk about the different answers that we came up with and compare and connect how they were similar and how they were different. So we focus on that standard for math practice of constructing viable arguments and making sure that the students understand what that standard for math practice means within our classroom, where we are critiquing the reasoning of others, so sharing our thinking with other students, and then also connecting it to our thinking, thinking about how it might be similar, how it might be different, and using different strategies as we're solving our problem. My planned teacher and student actions, these are all ones that I considered prior to my lesson to just so that I can run my lesson a little bit more smoothly and kind of think about those action steps that I wanted myself to take and the possible actions that students might take. So with my teacher actions, I prompted students to participate with a 3-read strategy as we decomposed the problem, making sure that they understood what the situation of the problem is. We also talked about the quantities within our problem, thinking about mathematical questions that we can ask within our problem. And the SEAD strategy comes from Stanford Education with the math language routines. And I think previously Jenny might have shared out in the chat this resource. And this is a great resource to use in your classroom. It's a resource that supports English language learners, but it's a great resource for all students. I worked on asking guiding questions when I was launching the task, and as students were working, I made sure to monitor and ask clarifying questions. Students approached the problem in different ways, so I made sure that they knew that it was okay to approach the problem in different ways, and that was something that promoted their agency. And although that wasn't the big focus of my lesson, I wanted to try to incorporate little bits of different SEAD themes that I would later use within my classroom. For our students' actions, they were mostly working on making sense of the problem, solving their strategies in any way that they wanted, and they also worked on sharing their thinking and ideas. And similar to Nathan, there were strategies that I provided, such as sentence frames, to support them as they were sharing their thinking with one another, as well as sharing their thinking with the class. For my lesson outcome and reflection, I think similar to Nathan, I really like the time to really think about the SEAD themes and their intersection with my lesson and the math content standards, as well as the standards for math practice. I think just thinking about those themes prior to teaching the lesson, make sure that you are planning those intentional opportunities for students to ensure that those SEAD themes are being prevalent in your classroom. And so I had chosen discourse, and my students had worked a lot with having partner talk, but I wanted to make sure that they were also comparing and connecting strategies and ensuring that they understood that every strategy, like although it may have been different from theirs, was valued within our classroom and that we can make connections with it. And so here on this slide, you'll see an example of the charted strategies that we talked about. And so we had two answers that I kind of chose for students to present. One student claimed that each brother will watch the puppy for 4 4/5 of an hour. And another student claimed that each brother would watch the puppy for 4 hours and 48 minutes. We had a great conversation as a class thinking about, are those answers the same? Are they different? Why or why not? And they really had to justify their responses. And they were really focusing a lot on each other's strategies and thinking about, well, are both of these responses correct? Can they both be correct? And so a lot of the student talk was really amplified by just adjusting a small task and making sure it was open-ended so that I was promoting that discourse within my classroom. Personally, I loved using the lesson planning template. I think as I use it more often in my classroom, I won't necessarily have to maybe write out all the steps within using the lesson planning template, and it'll come naturally to just think about implementing those SEAD themes into the classroom more quickly.
Thank you, Karina and Nathan. I love hearing stories of your classrooms and the ways in which you structured learning for students so that you're attending to the math content, but also the social and emotional and academic development of students simultaneously. It's just super, super fun to hear those stories. We have just a few minutes for questions for our guests, and then we'll get to our wrap-up slides that we'll share with you the links so you can get information about joining our community of practice and also the professional learning certificate. But if you have questions, I already highlighted one because Louise put one in the chat just a minute ago. So I'll start with that question. And then as Karina and Nathan are answering that question, if others have questions for either of them, you can go ahead and type it in the chat. But the question that Louise had, and you sort of just addressed it, Karina, but you might want to just expand on that. And Nathan, you could speak to it too, is how often are you able to create a SEAD/SMP lesson? It seems like a lot of work, and wondering how long it would take for this to become part of your instructional routine. So if you have thoughts about that, and then feel free while they're answering, if anybody else has questions, to type them in the chat.
So I would sort of echo what Karina was saying. I think the first time I used the template, the lesson took quite a while to plan. I wouldn't want to spend necessarily that much time planning every single lesson that way. But I think as you start to utilize those themes more in your instruction, it becomes a little easier for you to see spots that you can embed them down the road. I also think that a lot of those SEAD themes can really come to life in routines that don't have to necessarily be the focus of a lesson, but the routine that you could do once or twice a week in addition to the content. I think that's another really great way to boost it. Yeah, Karina, maybe you have something to add as well.
Yeah, I think something that we kind of talked about within our own community of practice as educators that implemented this SEAD theme last year is that discourse was one that was easy for all of us to implement within our classroom. Maybe some of the other ones, they do all require a lot more of that intentionality to make sure that it's prevalent within your classroom. I think, like Nathan said, it does take time to use a whole lesson planning template, but using it once in a while for lessons that you feel like could lend itself well to it, I think is a great way to just introduce those SEAD themes and just also to keep it into your own thoughts as an educator when you're doing those planning processes that later on you can share with colleagues, and maybe colleagues have ideas of how you can introduce it in the classroom. And it's just a great idea to get kind of like started. And then later on, I feel like it might be a little bit easier where you don't have to do the entire lesson planning template and just think about where you can integrate that SEAD theme.
Great, thank you. I'll just do one more question that somebody had for Nathan, and then we'll wrap up. So somebody wrote, Nathan, that they noticed you chose 2 seed themes, and might just picking one be a good way to start. And I also, that question made me think of what you had said earlier about seeing connections between some of the themes. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that, about picking one versus selecting more than one, and to the degree that they're connected also.
Absolutely, yeah. I would say it's dependent on the lesson that you're teaching. As I was reflecting on the content standard that I knew I wanted to teach and thinking about ways for students to explore that, I was really hard pressed to pick between discourse and agency. So that was sort of my reason. I said, you know what, I'm going to try them both. As I mentioned earlier, I do see a lot of interweaving and connecting between the seed themes. I think the more time that you spend with it, the more that you'll see those connections too, and the more the light bulb will go off that, hey, this is a spot where I can embed this. Or when I'm doing this, I'm kind of already talking about agency. If I do this or add this to it, it takes it up even more. So I would say certainly the first time you're doing it, if you've got a lesson, I wouldn't necessarily try to do more than one theme. For me specifically, I saw this lesson and I was like, I can't decide which one because I see elements of both. So I just was like, I'm going to just try both.
Great, thank you. And somebody wrote in the chat just a second ago, I'll just answer this one quickly, both because it's related to us moving on also to our closure, but do we have any examples for more advanced high school lessons? And so I was going to say that one of our guests for the first webinar, Tara Warren, she actually teaches in a middle school, but she teaches a high school algebra course to middle school students. So she will be putting up a blog post on our series on our Peers and Pedagogy blogs around this theme, and she'll be putting a link to her lesson that she planned, which I can't remember if it was in an Algebra 1 class or an 8th grade math class, but that will be there. And this is kind of a plug for our community of practice. One of the reasons why we are excited about hosting a community of practice is we hope to actually collect a bigger bank of lessons that folks are using in their classrooms this fall. And we're hoping that those of you who join the community of practice will be willing to share with us some of those lessons that you're planning in your middle school and high school and maybe even primary classes. And so those grade levels that we don't have yet. So we definitely have a goal, and we're going to make sure that this fall we're gathering a bank of these lesson plans that illustrate the seed themes within the math classroom, and be putting them up on Achieve the Course so that folks have other resources to look at and examples. So I'll just close us out tonight. We really appreciate you joining us. We know that I think September must be the most exhausting month for educators, maybe in addition to like June or May, depending on when your school year ends. But we appreciate you spending some time during this busy month with us this evening learning about this. We really think right now this year, given it's always important, that given the events of the past year and a half, it's really extra important that teachers are attending to social, emotional, and academic development of students. And even in math classrooms, that's even math teachers' jobs, not just other educators. So thank you for joining us. We hope you learned a lot and will be interested in joining us for other events in the future. We have one event that's on our Eventbrite posted right now that's coming up on next week on the 22nd. It's a coffee conversation, which is a different format. And those folks get to go into breakout rooms and discuss the topic. So it's a little more interactive in coffee conversations, but that's going to be on decolonizing instruction with Maribel Gonzalez. And any future webinars and coffee conversations that we have will be on our Eventbrite, and so you can actually follow us on there so that you can be alerted when we post new events. We typically do coffee conversations once a month, and webinars are a little more sporadic than that, but they're all there. So I said earlier in the webinar this evening that we really value your feedback. We always aim to get better at supporting educators and providing professional learning opportunities. And so this link here can be both for providing us feedback and getting your certificate for your 1 hour of professional learning tonight. Even if you're not interested in the certificate or don't need it, we'd really appreciate you spending a few minutes providing feedback for us. And then I said earlier tonight that folks that either watch live or asynchronously watch the recording later, webinars 1 and 2, so you have to watch both of them. and do it by September 24th. Those folks will then be invited. You'll get an email from us after the 24th to join our community of practice. And so we'll be having 3 community of practice meetings. We hope the same folks will come to all 3 of them because we want to put you into smaller groups that are grade alike and role alike groups for you to be able to collaborate with other educators from across the country all 3 times around planning lessons using the SEAD template and implementing them either in your classroom or maybe supporting teachers to do that if you're in a support role like an instructional coach or a leader. So those 3 meetings will be on October 5th, November 9th, December 7th. They're a little bit longer to give us more time to chat and interact with one another. So they're an hour and 15 minutes. And again, that bit.ly will be your attendance form that says you were here at this webinar tonight. If you watch webinar 1, there's a bit.ly and a QR code at the end of webinar 1 that you'll have to take a separate attendance quick survey to let us know that you watched webinar 1, and then we'll be looking for folks that fill out both the webinar 1 and webinar 2 attendance forms to invite them to the community of practice. So we hope to have lots of folks join us for that. We anticipate being able to chat about lessons that folks are planning, how they went, and when they were implementing them in their classrooms. And like I said, we're hoping to be able to even collect a bank of lessons that we can share more broadly so that everybody has examples of what this looks like in their grade levels. And again, if you missed part 1 and you really want to attend the community practice and you're here tonight and didn't see part 1, you can go to that link to watch it. And at the end of that webinar, there's an attendance form for you to take. And it just has to be done before September 24th so that we can gather all the folks that are going to be invited and send you all an invitation link with a registration form. So with that, we are at the end of our program tonight. We thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Karina and Nathan, for sharing your experiences with us and your insight. It's always really, really great to hear from educators who are actually doing the work in their classrooms with students. And we hope you all have a really great evening. And we hope we'll see you back for either the community of practices or other webinars or future events that we host. Have a good evening.